So we had a nucleus of paid people, and we could actually work on it full time. And Phil had already started this concept of doing the hot, horny, and healthy seminars. And he would call the chapters together for these little demonstration type of presentations about how to prevent transmission of the virus. And he was a great educator and an effective person at getting people to think about the topic through humor, through just getting people involved.
Condom races.
All kinds of
all
things.
kinds of things.
To get people standing up and doing things and, hands-on with condoms, dildos, and it was a way of starting to do community-based education about preventing this new disease, and for the first time, a sexually transmitted disease that had to be stopped through each individual taking responsibility for stopping the spread of this disease. And we understood that it had to take every person in BWMT had to get involved in some way, on a personal level and on a community level. And then as members in a national organization, we could do something as a national group about the visibility of this issue to other gay groups and then to the whole nation that was starting to wake up to the importance of this issue.
I want to continue talking about the task force, but I want to go back a little now, because at some point your active participation in the NABWMT itself, as opposed to the task force, kind of came to an end, at least that was my understanding. Now, how did that come about? Did that have to do with the name change issue, or how was that? How did that develop?
At the same time as we were starting the task force on AIDS prevention and getting this grant at the national level, there was also this foment within all of the BWMT chapters about the name change issue. And I think part of the problem was that both of these things were happening at once, and it was overload for some people and for some chapters. They just could not cope with the national board trying to get them to talk about AIDS and also insisting that this name change issue be brought up. And the only reason we did it is because some of the chapters had already changed their name, and they were bringing resolutions to the board level for the other chapters to change their name and for the national to also change its name.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a natural progression. Once the New York chapter had begun the whole concept of men of all colors together, it had to be talked about on the national level.
Now, you were part of the New York chapter, and you said you think they may have changed their name before you affiliated, but
No, it was just after.
it was after.
Yeah,
And you were in favor of that name change.
of course.
And can you explain why?
Because already a city like New York was not just black and white. It was black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, every mixture of all of the above. And it just, the topic of race and gay people had to be enlarged beyond black and white. And the chapter wanted membership that was more than just black gay men and white gay men, and talking about race from just the framework of black and white. It was natural to want more, because our communities, especially New York, was more mixed, and a topic like racism, a topic like AIDS was impacting the whole community. And there was a framework for talking about those issues across racial lines. And of course, there were more blacks and whites involved in BWMT, but there were also representatives of other groups starting to get involved in it at the chapter level. So, in New York, it was a real easy progression to MACT, as I remember it. There wasn't any big struggle at the chapter level about the name change. It happened pretty smoothly.
What was your membership like in New York at that time? Was it a cross-section, or how did that develop?
Well, it was over 100 members. We would have large weekly meetings at the Gay Community Center. And it was still mostly black and white, but not exclusively. And it seemed to many of us that it was just natural to go beyond a simple dichotomy of race, black and white.
How did the chapter deal with expanding the name? Did the chapter create its own agenda to interest more groups than black and white, or did it rely on those people to come in and create their own agenda? How did that work, if you recall?
I recall it just whenever we would take a topic for a weekly discussion at the weekly meeting, we would just try to broaden it beyond a black-white perspective into a multiracial perspective. And I don't recall that we had to do specific outreach to other organizations or attract individuals into the group. We were a part of the community center in New York, and everybody was congregating at the community center. And it was easy to attract new people and to broaden discussions.
And those discussions were well received in your membership.
In New York.
Yeah.
But then I realized that it wasn't that way in all chapters. So.
But New York was the first chapter to change its name, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So how did this develop on the national level? I mean, as we look back now, 20 years ago, this was a sort of a watershed event, which, as we both remember, caused a lot of division. And I know you were pretty central in that whole discussion. So how do you recall that? How did it develop on the national level?
Well, one of the national conventions during that period was in New York, and we really worked hard to get good speakers from outside the organization. We had many women speakers that year. We talked about race from a whole different perspective than BWMT people were used to talking about. And I remember we just tried to have a convention that would open people up to new ideas and new topics and new ways of approaching the whole concept of being an interracial gay organization.
Now, let me just stop you. You said we had a lot of women speak, but you changed your name to Men of All Colors Together.
Right.
Was there a conscious decision or a consideration of including women and then not, or how did that work?
I don't remember any of this stuff being fully conscious. I remember we just moved from one step to another. And our membership was all men, and we didn't try to go beyond our membership at that point. But at the national convention, we could have speakers that enlarged our focus. We had to talk about race, economics, health, disease. These were the 80s, the topics that were on everybody's agenda at that point. But BWMT had to decide, did we want to incorporate all these issues or not? And in some chapters, they were really decided to not deal, to keep it a very limited social focus on just having social meetings of black gay men and white gay men for the purpose of socializing and nothing more. And the MACT chapter in New York City was very different. We wanted to talk about everything and wanted all these political topics to at least be brought out in the open.
I'm curious because I attended that New York convention, and I remember that during one of the workshops we listed just a whole long list of concerns that we had, and that we were. It seemed at that time that there was energy to go after all of these different concerns, and not considering social here, but just talking about various political and social issues. How do you feel generally about us, as has been the case in the last 10 years or so, focusing primarily on racism as opposed to the other isms, the other inequities, as we say in our communities and in our lives? Did you feel that this organization and could and should spread itself over these various issues, or that it should focus on one political and social issue? Right?
I think that's a good question, and it was all part of the dynamics of the time in the gay community, and different chapters had to approach it differently. But we as a national board had to provide both focus and a larger picture at the same time. And I think to some extent there was a conscious decision to talk about many subjects, but to focus on racism. It was
even at
hard.
that time, even in 1986, that was,
I think so.
Yeah.
That's what made the most sense. Yeah, we would come at this from, I still wanted to talk about South Africa, but it related to the topic of racism.
Sure.
When we all had to confront AIDS, because it was right in our midst as well as in the community we were a part of, we could relate that to racism as well, because the services and everything were being extended to black members of our community so much more slowly than to white members of our community. So the racism impacts everything, and there had to be both a focus on racism and a willingness to discuss it in a larger context. And how that played out was chaotic and different in every chapter.
Well, you talked about the New York convention and your very multicultural agenda in terms of workshops and stuff.
Yeah.
But the following year was when the matter really came to a head in the national. And what are your recollections of that Milwaukee convention in '87? And I realize some of them may be a little painful, but
No, not painful. I had my eyes wide open. I believed, and the New York chapter believed, that for this national organization to really have an impact and for it to be a vital organization, it would have to change its name at some point. That's just what we believed. And I think we were probably entirely right. But the organization wasn't ready for it. So it was a very tense dynamic the following year at the Milwaukee convention, which I remember as a very interesting, enjoyable experience, because I had never been to Milwaukee and I wanted to learn about the community and get out there and meet new people. But also the New York chapter decided to force the issue of the name change, and we were going to have a vote on whether or not the national organization would change its name to Men of All Colors Together. And it was a very close vote, and the majority of chapters voted against the name change, with many of the founding members of BWMT being the lead proponents of not changing. I talked about the principals in the AIDS work being me, Reggie, Phil, and even amongst the three of us, we were divided on the name change topic. And Phil was one of the leading proponents of keeping the name as it was. So we were determined that it wasn't going to be a divisive issue, but it was a very emotional topic for a lot of people.
Is there anything more specific you recall about
Well, I remember the debates. We had a formal debate on the topic. Then there was the voting, and I don't think anybody was really sure how the voting was going to take place. How the outcome was going to, what the outcome was going to be. In the end, it was a very close vote, and BWMT won out, but still the topic was going to continue, because at the chapter level, many of the chapters were deciding to go ahead and change. I think, and the members of the New York chapter were not going to let it die, and we're going to keep talking about Men of All Colors Together, no matter what. And then there were some dynamics that I thought were pretty ridiculous, because there were nominations for board members, and not all the nominees were black or white, and there was even this actual vote on how large the board would be, how many members would be board official board positions, and then how many of those board positions would be limited to white members and how many would be limited to black members, and therefore would there automatically be members of the board that weren't either white or black. And that was a thorny issue, to say the least. For a while we prevailed and insisted that there be board membership that wasn't black or white. But in some cases, it was just one position then that was reserved for a non-white, non-black person. And at that time, there was significant involvement of Native American, Asian, and Latino. And there were times when all of those groups were represented on the national board. But the commitment to really enlarge the membership was never there. Even though we did have board members who were, as I say, from other racial groups. And it really helped on the board level, I think, to have that increased participation and more perspectives than just the black and the white. But it didn't get translated into the name change or real broad membership from other groups. Partly because of the resistance and the financing of the group at that time was coming from our founder, Mike Smith, who sort of wanted to make his financial contributions contingent on keeping the name Black and White Men Together.
That was more on what he left us when he died.
He was still alive
right.
in '87,
right.
and he was saying unequivocally, if you change the name, you will not have my financial support. And he, at that time, was the only significant contributor.
Right. Well, in view of all that, and I was there, and I know how nasty it became. And personally, did you ever feel personally attacked? Were you personally attacked there, or your group, or your motives, or?
Yes. My motive was simply to enlarge the board and have board members who were not black or not white. They were from other racial groups. And I said that very openly. You know, and that doesn't seem like that controversial a thing to me. But I nominated people for those positions then who weren't known to other people who were active in the group. One of the people I nominated lived in Hawaii. Another lived in Puerto Rico. And the whole concept of introducing board members who weren't involved in a chapter and lived in other parts of the country just for the sake of enlarging our governing body and enlarging the perspectives that would be brought to our governing body. It wasn't appreciated. It was viewed as somebody trying to take over and introduce unknown individuals and foreign influences or something.
So in light of that, in the light that some of your motives were impugned and that obviously your point of view didn't prevail on the issue, what was your feeling about the national after that convention?
Well, actually, my point of view did prevail to the extent that the board structure
right, I understand.
had to have at least one member who was not black or white.
Right, there was a point at which the board was enlarged, this just for information purposes, to 17, and the membership could be no more than 8 black men and no more than 8 white. So there was one position reserved, and that was in the.
And it created an opening for, at that time, 2 members to join the board who were not black or white. One was Latino and one was Filipino, and that was helpful, I think, to the way the board functioned, the way our discussions took place, and the Latino who decided to become a leader had been involved in the chapter in Massachusetts for many years. So encouraging him to take a leadership role came about because we had that discussion. And he joined the board at that point. And up until that point, he had been viewed as the straggling lover of John Bush, as opposed to himself, Nelson Rivera, who could become a leader of our group. I think that ensuring that openness was a good thing, and on that limited issue, we did prevail for a while. And we had a national secretary who was a Native American. We had board members from other groups or other racial communities.
So, apart from that, and not apart from that fact, but the fact that the National did not change its name, and as it's turned out, never has, did your view of the National or your level of participation change any after the Milwaukee Convention?
Yeah, because at that point we got the grant for formulating our loose network that we called a task force on the board level. We could actually make it into an organization that would function day to day and do the day-to-day organizing to get every chapter involved in this AIDS work. And because we had a grant, we had to function. We had to do all of the objectives that we had laid out in the grant, and we had to have active participation from every chapter. So we traveled extensively. We had the funds, and Phil and Reggie and I went to all the chapters on a more systematic basis than had ever been done before. And that started right after the Milwaukee Convention. So that gave us a way of getting beyond, I think, the divisions that had come about because of the name change issue. We could focus our energies not on the division, but on the unifying aspect of actually implementing a national program for AIDS prevention. And the three of us became dedicated to that work and doing it every day, all day, and therefore creating the energy that would get the chapters involved. Always BWMT has had the problem of communications. Before the internet age, we were limited to telephoning each other and having very haphazard communications. But the fact that we had a budget that didn't rely on Mike Smith's donation, we could do a lot of programming and political work necessarily focused on AIDS, but it was the work of all the chapters.
So is it accurate to say that from that point on, your active involvement, specifically with the National, was almost entirely through the task force?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, in those early years, the task force was directly under the National. Right? How did that, in your view, work out in practice or in theory?
Well, there's a term for the formality of it. It's called fiscal sponsorship. BWMT had the 501c3, the tax-exempt status, and the ability to receive the federal grant. The task force was a nucleus within BWMT and did not have its own incorporation papers or tax-exempt status. So necessarily the board of BWMT was the formal governing structure of the task force. And there had to be a lot of communication then between Reggie, Phil, and I as the leaders of the day-to-day work and the board of BWMT. But there was all kinds of room for misunderstandings and miscommunications to start entering the picture. And in fact, the board of BWMT never wanted to be a grant administrator, never understood what their obligations were for reporting on the use of the funding to the federal government, and certainly didn't want to deal with $1 million. They were used to budgets of a few $100s mostly. And so the whole idea of being a fiscal sponsor and financially responsible for that kind of budget was just beyond the realm of many members and even board members. Mm-hmm. So it was a difficult relationship, but we had to be in constant communication and we had to be involved with each other. We couldn't go our separate ways until much later, when things just got too volatile. That framework couldn't function anymore after about 3 or 4 years. Trying to make it work, it just fell apart.
So, leaving that for a minute, how did the work of the task force then take place? Did you have a physical location? Was there actually an office at that point?
Yeah, right away we found an office with a religious organization in San Francisco. And Reggie and his partner at that time, Tim, were the office staff. And they shared a tiny office with Lutheran Social Concerns or something.
You were still
which had a gay
Washington.
staff member.
I'm sorry.
And that was located in San Francisco. I personally was still in Washington.
And Phil was in
Los Angeles. So we were on the phone daily to each other, talking about how to get this going and how to make it function and how to do our outreach to all the chapters, get them all involved, have a task force representative from all the chapters, how to have national meetings, and who would pay for the airplane tickets and all these things.
Did you divide up the work in some fashion? Did certain of you do certain tasks and others?
Reggie was the executive director, Phil was the education director, and I was the administrative director.
So you continued to have the grant writing and collecting responsibility and the fiscal reporting. And
we realized we had to also have an outside person do the actual accounting. None of us was a professional accountant, and being responsible for a yearly budget that at that time was at least $200,000 a year was, not something that any of us was used to dealing with, and we wanted it to all be very above board. We didn't want to get into problems with the federal government, and we didn't want the BWMT National Board to get completely distracted by having to do accounting for this money. So we hired somebody to be our accountant, an outside person completely. And I had to daily be in touch with all those dynamics of paying the bills and buying the airline tickets and just doing all the minutia of correctly accounting for the money and paying the bills and writing the checks. Every check had to have two signatures, and if one of the signatures was in Washington, D.C. and the other was in San Francisco, it was hard to get the check signed. But, we had to create this and get going on it because we had the imperative to do so, both from our own membership and the increasing health risks that we were all dealing with, as well as now the federal government saying, hey, let's go, let's get this going. And we actually responded more quickly than the other organizations that got the funding. There were about 30 groups that got funding from this pool of money. And we were one of the first to really get going with our actual work. And Phil scheduled the Hot, Horny, and Healthy seminars or workshops in all the different chapters, and we got it going. We got up and running.
You referred to the 30 organizations that got money from this pool of funding. What was that actual pool? Was that a piece of legislation that had authorized a huge amount of money? Was that through the CDC or?
Well, yeah, Congress created this funding source through the Centers for Disease Control. And so the people who won the grant competition were actually direct federal grantees. And that's why we were told that no gay organization could ever get money directly from the federal treasury, because at that time, that was just unheard of. I mean, no one gave us a chance of getting that funding, because you had to be an established national health organization or the National Urban League or some, a very established organization in order to make the approach to the federal government. And there was huge surprise and shock when we got it.
Were we the only gay organization?
Yes. And
did we all get the same amount of money, or were there big differences between organizations?
There were differences based on the applications. And then, as I said, we were one of the first to really get up and running and using our whole first year grant money. Some of the other groups were really tired about it. They knew they had the inside line to getting this grant money, but they weren't that interested in taking on AIDS, really. So some of them took a year to get their staff hired and stuff. We had our staff in place before we even got the money. So we were ready to jump into it. And that was appreciated by the federal government. But they got a lot of static from outside commentators who, wrote columns and published them nationally, criticizing our approach to AIDS and why the federal government would be giving money for Hot, Horny, and Healthy. So we had to deal with so many dynamics.
So we not only had a staff in place, but we had programs already in mind.
Exactly.
And we had a network of chapters that were presumably going to receive.
That's why we were perfect for this grant. But we were still told that we couldn't get it. So we were encouraged to try and come in under the umbrella of some other group and maybe get a little piece of money out of it to do our Hot, Horny, and Healthy thing or something, But Phil, Reggie, and I said, why not go for broke? Why not try to be one of the principal grantees for this organization, for this funding program.
Do you have any feeling as to why we did get the grant when everybody told us we wouldn't or couldn't? You
We fit the criteria perfectly, to be honest. We were an existing group that had already started forming a network and trying to do exactly what the topic was, preventing the spread of this disease. And because we fit the criteria perfectly, they couldn't deny us. And, you know, not to toot my own horn too much, but the grant was written in a way that they almost couldn't deny us unless they wanted to use overt prejudice against a gay organization. And they couldn't actually, they had reviewers brought in from community-based organizations who didn't find anything objectionable about a gay organization being involved, because gay men's health crisis was already there on the front lines. Mm-hmm. Gay people were in all these other organizations. Why couldn't a gay organization receive a direct federal grant? There was nothing prohibiting it. Mm-hmm. There was just all this prejudice that tried to say it was impossible. And Reggie and Phil and I were not ones to say, okay, we accept, it's impossible. We all just looked at the grant and said, why can't we do this? But it had to be a well-written grant. And I take full credit for that part of it.
And you should. Well, how long did you actually work for the task force? You
5
started
years.
in 87. Right?
5 years. Or 6 years.
And how did that develop? How did that proceed over the time?
Very slowly. We jumped into it with 2 feet, 4 hands, and whatever we could throw into it. All the chapters got involved, and we really did create a dynamic where every chapter was willing to throw in with this effort, whereas prior to us being really that organized, there had been a lot of resistance on the chapter level to taking up this topic. And we had to do it in such a way that the federal government would be satisfied with our record keeping, and so we documented every single thing we did. If a chapter had a discussion, or if the budding chapter in Louisville just got together on a Friday night for a small discussion on AIDS, we documented it. We had a format for putting everything on paper and fulfilling our objectives, which was to get every chapter involved. We had to do a survey initially of all of our members, and then black gay men in the communities of each chapter. So we surveyed about 1,200 people and used that data to prove that how necessary this work was. Mm-hmm. And our survey got covered by the